When German prisoners of war were finally allowed to read the letters that had been waiting for them, many expected relief or reassurance, but instead found themselves holding words that reopened doubts they had managed to silence, discovering that some messages were heavier to carry than captivity itself. At first, the men unfolded the letters slowly, rereading familiar handwriting and lingering over ordinary phrases. But as lines blurred and meanings settled in, they realized that these messages did not simply connect them to home, because each word carried news that no one in the camp could explain, forcing them to sit with questions that letters were never meant to answer. The letters did not arrive all at once, and that alone unsettled the German prisoners, because waiting had already taught them how uncertainty could stretch time into something heavier than confinement. Names were called individually, envelopes handed out without ceremony, and each man was left to decide when to open what had traveled so far to reach his hands. Some unfolded the paper immediately, while others held it longer, as if delaying the moment might soften whatever waited inside. The paper felt thin, almost fragile, and many noticed how quiet the barracks became once the letters were distributed. No one spoke. No one watched. The freedom to read privately carried an unfamiliar pressure, because there would be no shared reaction to absorb the moment. Each man would face his words alone. The absence of instruction made the act feel personal in a way few had anticipated. As the letters were opened, familiar handwriting emerged, bringing with it a sudden closeness that unsettled rather than comforted. Ordinary details appeared first. Mentions of weather, routines, small reassurances meant to sound normal. And for a brief moment, some prisoners allowed themselves to believe that nothing essential had changed. But as eyes moved further down the page, the tone often shifted, subtly at first, then unmistakably as reality pressed through careful phrasing. Many letters avoided direct statements, circling around loss without naming it, hinting at shortages, silence, or absence without explanation. What was not written carried as much weight as what was. Men reread sentences repeatedly, searching for meaning between the lines, aware that loved ones had likely chosen restraint deliberately. The effort to protect someone through omission only deepened the uncertainty. For some prisoners, the letters introduced contradictions that could not be resolved. A familiar voice described daily life continuing as if nothing had changed, while the prisoner knew entire cities lay damaged or empty. Others received messages filled with optimism that felt misplaced, creating a quiet distance between memory and reality. The words no longer aligned with what the men had learned to accept. What troubled many was the realization that the letters demanded response, even when no answer felt possible. Reading them was not a passive act. It carried responsibility. Each sentence raised questions about what could be said in return, what should be hidden, and what truth might cause harm if acknowledged too clearly. The freedom to read had brought with it the burden of deciding how much reality to allow back into their lives. Some men folded their letters carefully and placed them away, unable to finish reading in one sitting. Others kept theirs open on their laps, staring without moving, as if the words had pinned them in place. The camp offered no guidance on how to process what they had learned, no structure to frame the experience. The silence around them did not soften the moment. It amplified it. As the hours passed, the presence of the letters lingered, shaping behavior subtly. Conversations slowed. Movements became deliberate. The knowledge carried inside those envelopes felt heavier than the paper itself, because it connected the men to a world that had continued without them, changed in ways they could not fully see or understand from a distance. By the end of the day, many prisoners realized that receiving mail was not the relief they had imagined. The letters had reopened paths of thought they had carefully closed, reminding them that captivity did not isolate them from consequence, but merely delayed it. The words from home did not bring answers. They introduced questions that would follow them long after the paper was folded again. And in that realization, the men began to understand that reading their own letters was not a return to comfort, but the beginning of a quieter struggle, one that unfolded not in the presence of guards or fences, but inside the space where memory, responsibility, and uncertainty met without protection. After the initial shock faded, the German prisoners found that the letters did not settle into memory the way they expected because they refused to remain confined to the moment they were read. Words resurfaced repeatedly, replayed in the mind with altered emphasis, as if each rereading revealed a different meaning that had been hidden beneath familiarity. The letters were no longer messages. They had become questions without clear answers. Many prisoners began to notice how carefully the letters were written. Phrases felt measured, pauses intentional, omissions deliberate. The absence of certain names, the avoidance of specific places, the careful use of hopeful language where none seemed appropriate all suggested that the writers had been protecting someone, perhaps the prisoner, perhaps themselves. This restraint created a quiet tension, because it forced the reader to imagine what had been left unsaid. Some men compared their letters mentally, not by sharing details, but by sensing similarities in tone. Too much optimism felt suspicious. Too little information felt deliberate. Each letter seemed to balance between reassurance and concealment, leaving the prisoner to interpret what reality might look like beyond the camp. The effort to read between the lines became exhausting, as imagination filled the gaps with possibilities that could not be confirmed. What troubled many was the realization that the letters had reversed a familiar dynamic. Inside the camp, silence had once felt imposed, yet now it was chosen by those writing from home. The prisoners were no longer being withheld from information by force, but by care. This distinction made the absence of clarity harder to accept because it could not be resisted or challenged without risking harm. The responsibility of interpretation weighed heavily. Every sentence demanded judgment. Every word carried potential significance. Some men fixated on small details, such as a change in handwriting or a phrase that sounded unlike the person they remembered, wondering whether it reflected stress, fear, or loss. These details lingered, magnified by distance and uncertainty. As the days passed, the letters began to shape how prisoners viewed their own captivity. Messages describing ordinary routines at home made camp life feel suspended in time, while hints of hardship intensified feelings of disconnection. The contrast between the controlled environment of the camp and the unknown realities beyond its fences created an emotional imbalance that no amount of routine could correct. For some, the letters reopened feelings they had deliberately suppressed. Memories of family gatherings, familiar streets, and everyday sounds returned with unexpected intensity, making the present feel more fragile. The camp had offered structure and predictability, but the letters disrupted that balance, reminding the prisoners that life outside continued to move forward without them. Others responded by distancing themselves from the letters, choosing not to reread them, fearing that repeated exposure would deepen uncertainty rather than resolve it. Folding the paper carefully became a way to contain the weight of what they had learned, even though the questions remained. The act of setting the letters aside did not erase their influence. It merely postponed confrontation. By the end of this phase, many prisoners understood that reading their letters was not a single event, but an ongoing process. Each message carried implications that unfolded over time, reshaping perception gradually rather than immediately. The words from home did not close the distance between worlds. They highlighted it, forcing the men to navigate a connection that felt both intimate and unreachable. And in that realization, the prisoners sensed that the letters had introduced a new form of waiting, one that did not depend on guards or schedules, but on interpretation, patience, and the unresolved space between what was written and what could never be fully known. As time passed, the German prisoners began to notice that the letters were no longer confined to private moments, because their presence subtly altered the atmosphere of the barracks even when they were not being read. Envelopes rested inside pockets or beneath mattresses, yet their weight seemed to travel with the men, shaping how they moved, sat, and interacted with one another. The room itself felt different, as if the words from outside had entered and refused to leave. Some prisoners found that reading their letters had changed how they looked at the others around them. Familiar faces now carried imagined histories, losses, or silences that could not be confirmed. A man who appeared calm might be holding devastating news, while another who spoke easily might be clinging to reassurance that felt fragile. Without sharing details, the prisoners sensed that each of them was carrying something private and unresolved, and that awareness created distance rather than closeness. Conversations shifted accordingly. Topics became safer, narrower, chosen to avoid stirring emotions that no one felt prepared to address. Laughter, when it appeared, felt brief and cautious, as if joy itself required permission. The letters had not demanded silence, but they had introduced an awareness that made speech feel intrusive because words risked colliding with thoughts others were struggling to contain. Some men noticed that they were reading their letters repeatedly, not in search of new information, but to anchor themselves to a version of reality that felt increasingly unstable. Each rereading brought a different emotion: hope one day, doubt the next, resignation after that. The letters did not offer clarity. They shifted shape with the reader's state of mind, reflecting uncertainty back at them. Others avoided rereading altogether, fearing that repetition would deepen confusion rather than resolve it. They folded the paper carefully, placing it out of sight, yet the content lingered, influencing behavior indirectly. Decisions felt heavier. Reactions slowed. The camp's routines continued, but the internal rhythm of the men had changed, shaped by words that refused to settle into certainty. What troubled many was the realization that the letters had quietly reintroduced choice into their lives. Before, captivity had simplified existence, narrowing decisions to survival and compliance. Now, each message from home required interpretation, response, and emotional positioning. The men had to decide what to believe, what to doubt, and what to carry forward, all without guidance. This responsibility deepened feelings of isolation. Even surrounded by others, each prisoner faced his letter alone, unable to share its contents without risking misunderstanding or exposure. The shared experience of captivity fractured into individual struggles shaped by private knowledge. The camp no longer held a single emotional reality. It contained many, layered and unseen. As days passed, some prisoners began to sense that the letters had altered how they perceived time. The present felt suspended between past memories, and an uncertain future hinted at through careful phrasing. The camp, once defined by routines and repetition, now existed alongside imagined scenes from home, creating a mental divide that made neither place feel fully real. In this way, the letters did more than deliver news. They transformed the space in which the prisoners lived. The barracks became a place where unseen stories coexisted, where silence carried context, and where every man navigated a private landscape shaped by words that had traveled far but could not fully bridge the distance they revealed. And as the prisoners adjusted to this new reality, Many understood that the letters had quietly changed the nature of captivity itself, shifting its weight inward, away from fences and schedules, and into the thoughts they carried with them each day, shaping how they endured the waiting that still lay ahead. As the weeks went on, the German prisoners began to realize that the letters had created a distance they could not measure, because they connected them to home while simultaneously confirming how far away that home had become. The words arrived intact, yet the world they described felt increasingly unfamiliar, as if language itself struggled to bridge what had changed in their absence. Many prisoners noticed that the letters spoke of endurance rather than life. Phrases emphasized survival, patience, and hope for reunion, while avoiding details that might anchor those sentiments in reality. The restraint felt intentional, a careful attempt to offer comfort without revealing how fragile circumstances truly were. This approach left the prisoners suspended between reassurance and suspicion, unsure which version of events to believe. What troubled them most was that the letters could not respond to their reactions. Questions surfaced immediately, but answers would take weeks if they arrived at all. The delay transformed reading into an incomplete conversation, one-sided and unresolved. Every line prompted a response that had nowhere to go, leaving thoughts to echo without closure. Some prisoners began drafting replies in their minds long before touching paper. They rehearsed sentences repeatedly, weighing how much truth to reveal and how much to conceal. Writing back felt like an act of responsibility because every word sent outward carried the potential to shape how their families perceived captivity. The freedom to write was accompanied by the burden of deciding what version of themselves to present. Others struggled with the realization that their letters would also be filtered through distance and time. What they wrote would arrive late, stripped of context, and interpreted in ways they could not control. This awareness made expression feel risky because sincerity might be misunderstood and silence might be mistaken for detachment. Communication no longer felt direct. It felt mediated by uncertainty. The contrast between the structured life of the camp and the instability implied in the letters intensified this tension. Inside the camp, days followed predictable rhythms, offering a sense of containment. Beyond the fences, the letters suggested a world still shifting, still absorbing the war's consequences. The prisoners existed between these realities, belonging fully to neither. As time passed, the men found that the letters had subtly reshaped their sense of identity. They were no longer simply prisoners waiting to return home. They were observers of a world in transition, receiving fragments rather than clarity. The people they remembered and the places they imagined began to diverge from the descriptions they read, creating a quiet grief for a home that might not exist as they remembered it. Some prisoners responded by idealizing the past, clinging to memories untouched by the present. Others prepared themselves for loss, reading between the lines for signs of absence or destruction. Both approaches offered temporary stability, yet neither resolved the underlying uncertainty. The letters did not guide them toward acceptance or hope. They forced them to navigate ambiguity alone. By this stage, many understood that the greatest challenge posed by the letters was not the news they carried, but the limitations they revealed. Words could travel across oceans, but they could not restore immediacy or certainty. The prisoners were connected to home, yet separated by a gap language could not close. And in that realization, the men began to sense that the letters were not bridges, but reminders of distance, reinforcing the understanding that some experiences could not be shared fully through writing, and that the waiting they endured would continue to be shaped as much by what remained unsaid as by what was written on the page. By the time the German prisoners recognized that the letters had become part of their daily existence, They understood that the messages no longer belonged to the moment they were read, but to a longer process that reshaped how they endured captivity. The envelopes remained folded and stored away, yet their presence lingered, influencing thought and behavior in ways that could not be reversed by simply setting the paper aside. Many men noticed that their sense of waiting had changed. Before the letters, time inside the camp had been measured by routine and repetition, predictable in its emptiness. After the letters arrived, waiting took on a new texture because it now carried anticipation, regret, and unresolved questions. Days felt heavier, shaped not only by what was happening, but by what might already have happened beyond their reach. The prisoners began to understand that the letters had returned responsibility to them quietly. Reading them required judgment, and responding to them demanded restraint. Every decision about what to write back carried moral weight, because words sent home could offer comfort or deepen anxiety. The men found themselves calculating emotional consequences rather than immediate ones, a form of awareness that felt unfamiliar inside captivity. Some prisoners delayed writing altogether, uncertain how to reconcile their own experience with a version of reality their families might imagine. Others wrote carefully constructed replies, choosing reassurance over honesty, believing that protection mattered more than accuracy. In either case, the act of writing reinforced the realization that communication was no longer passive, but an active choice with lasting impact. As weeks passed, the letters subtly altered how the men related to the camp itself. The routines that once provided stability now felt temporary, overshadowed by imagined futures shaped by distant words. The camp existed as a place of suspension, neither fully present nor fully detached from the world beyond its fences. The letters had reopened a connection that could not be resolved within the camp's boundaries. Some prisoners sensed that they were grieving something they could not yet define. It was not only the loss of home as it had been, but the loss of certainty about who they would be when they returned. The letters had introduced versions of the future that felt incomplete, forcing the men to imagine lives shaped by absence, rebuilding, or change they could not control. Others found that the letters intensified self-reflection. Without clear answers, they revisited choices made during the war, questioning responsibility and consequence in ways they had postponed. The camp, once a place of external control, now functioned as a space for internal reckoning, prompted by words that carried emotional weight without offering direction. By the time the prisoners fully grasped the impact of the letters, the transformation was already settled. The messages had not provided clarity or comfort in the way they had hoped. Instead, they had reshaped captivity into something more complex, intertwining memory, responsibility, and uncertainty into the act of waiting itself. And in that understanding, the men realized that the most enduring effect of the letters was not the news they contained, but the questions they left behind, questions that followed them quietly, shaping how they endured captivity and how they would eventually face the world that awaited them beyond the camp. By the time the German prisoners folded their letters for the last time and placed them back beneath mattresses or inside coat pockets, many understood that the words they had read would not stay confined to paper, because they had already reshaped how waiting felt, how memory returned, and how responsibility quietly settled into their lives. The letters had not brought the relief they imagined, nor the certainty they hoped for, but something far less defined and far more enduring. What lingered was the awareness that connection did not always comfort, and that news from home could deepen uncertainty rather than resolve it. The prisoners had learned that distance did not erase obligation, and that reading a familiar handwriting could reopen questions that captivity had temporarily pushed aside. The camp had once narrowed their world, The letters expanded it again, but without clarity. Some would later say that receiving mail kept them human. Others would say it made endurance harder. Many struggled to describe the experience at all because it did not fit the simple expectations they carried into captivity. It was neither kindness nor cruelty, but a quiet confrontation with change they could not influence and answers that would not arrive on time. In the end, what stayed with them was not the specific words written on the page, but the realization that waiting could take many forms, and that some of the heaviest burdens were carried silently, introduced not by fences or guards, but by messages from a world that had continued to move forward without them. And long after the war ended, many remembered that captivity did not only test their ability to endure confinement, but their ability to live with uncertainty, learning that some questions, once opened, would remain unanswered long after the letters were folded away. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.